Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University. Today, you'll hear from three colleagues about the many ways that China leverages its science and technology outreach to improve its future in technology, especially emerging tech. But before we start, I'd like to do a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and you experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else yet. We'll come back to that after the presentation. And now it's my pleasure to hand the reins over to Anna Puglisi. She's a Senior Fellow with CSET. She previously served as the National Counterintelligence Officer for East Asia, advising senior US and foreign government officials at the highest levels, academia, and the private sector on counterintelligence issues. As a member of the Senior Analytics Service, she developed multidisciplinary efforts to understand global technology developments and their impact on US competitiveness and national security, as well as efforts to target US technology. She is a co-author of the 2013 study, Chinese Industrial Espionage, the first book-length treatment of the topic, and a contributing author to the recently released book, China's Quest for Foreign Technology Beyond Espionage, as well as countless related studies. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Welcome, everyone. Perhaps no other subject has captured the attention of US policymakers, allies, and scholars alike than China's multi-decade effort to spur its S&T development and what that development has had impact on China's economic development and military modernization. Today, we will walk you through some of those goals, the role technology acquisition plays in China's efforts, and leave you with some mitigation strategies. I'm joined by my colleagues here today, Emily Weinstein. Emily is a research analyst here also at CSET, whose focuses on Chinese innovation and domestic S&T policies and development. Emily holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown and a BA in Asian Studies from the University of Michigan. I'm also joined by my colleague, Ryan Fedasiuk, who is also a research analyst here at CSET. His research explores military applications of artificial intelligence, as well as China's efforts to acquire foreign technical information. He holds a BA in International Studies and a minor in Russian from American University, and is currently enrolled here at Georgetown in the Security Studies program. First, Ryan will outline the breadth and scale of China's efforts, as highlighted in our recent Chinese State Budget Council tracker. He will then be followed by Emily, the author of CSET's Chinese Talent Program Tracker, who will propose risk assessment strategies to mitigate the threat, support the research community, and promote academic collaboration that benefits the US. Ryan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Anna, for that wonderful introduction. So hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Fedasiuk. Emily, if we could go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be discussing China's pursuit of its technology future. It's no secret that China is pursuing comprehensive national power, and a cornerstone of that power is its science and technology capability. But to really forge ahead in building a world-class S&T ecosystem, China, like any country, needs three things. These are people, the staff members who work at universities, laboratories, and companies; information, the technical knowledge that can be absorbed through co-publication, through research funding, as well as scholarships and joint ventures; and equipment, the machinery and advanced tools necessary for research and development and manufacturing. Now, China pursues a wide variety of processes and tools to acquire all three of these resources. And in what follows, we'll present to you a menu of information about some of these processes that we've been doing deep dives into at CSET.
All right, thanks, Ryan, for that introduction. And as Anna mentioned, my name is Emily Weinstein. So following on what Ryan covered is kind of the larger ambitions on that Beijing has been working towards as far as specifically science and technology. We wanted to kind of then dive a little bit deeper into the larger technology transfer ecosystem. So we've kind of categorized these into three buckets based on research done by some of our CSET colleagues as well. So we've categorized these as legal activities, illegal, and extralegal. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to mainly focus on the extralegal side of this, as we define extralegal in this sense as types of technology transfer where the organizations that sponsor these activities are not subject to outside scrutiny, meaning that the legality of the transactions is unknowable. And as you can see from the list of what we've included on there, a lot of these tend to fall in what a lot of people refer to as the gray area. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on some of these, including Chinese professional associations and some of the university Chinese university aspects of technology transfer. But as you can see, this is a very kind of broad, large-scale issue that we obviously cannot cover in an hour-long presentation. So we've narrowed it down, and we're going to dive a little deeper now. So to begin, Chinese government documents and policy statements have aimed at really absorbing information through various means, as we saw with the different types of technology transfer. But one of the ways that they do this is through collaborations. And one of the big pieces of this to kind of keep in mind as we talk through this entire presentation is the concept of Chinese military civil fusion, or MCF as it's often referred to. And I took a quote here from the Department of Defense's China Military Power Report that came out in 2020, as they have one of the most comprehensive definitions of China's military civil fusion strategy that I've seen to date from US government. And you know, a key piece to this, I think, that I want to highlight is the fact that MCF means that there is not a clear line between the PRC's civilian and military economies, raising due diligence costs for US and global entities that do not desire to contribute to the PRC's military modernization. This, I think, is really the piece of MCF that needs to be paid attention to in the US, and same within our ally governments, because we really have to take a more nuanced approach to looking at how we do collaborations, who we interact with. And it's not to say that this is a zero-sum game where we either collaborate wholeheartedly or we don't collaborate at all. It's more of a spectrum. And I think Ryan and I will touch on a few of these issues and kind of where that nuance has to come throughout the presentation. So moving into some of the more detailed side of this presentation, we wanted to put up a graphic that we used from one of our recent reports entitled Chinese universities and the Chinese defense technology workforce, where what we started out doing actually was looking at how Chinese universities, specifically those in the top kind of 42, which are considered double first class universities, similar to kind of a bigger Ivy League in the US, how these types of universities and I'm sorry, the Seven Sons of National Defense, which are a group of 7 Chinese universities under the administration of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and are closely tied to the defense apparatus. So we started off with that group of about 42 universities. And what we did was we started off looking at, okay, how do these universities feed into Chinese defense companies? And you can see that's kind of on the right-hand side of this. And you can see they're feeding into, the top ones. We've got AVIC, CASC, CASIC, some that a lot of people have probably heard of. But what we ended up doing, and Ryan will go into more detail on this in a moment, we ended up finding that US tech companies may be inadvertently training China's next generation defense engineers through various types of collaborations. And I think Ryan has a few specific examples, or maybe one in particular that he wants to highlight.
Sure. So if you look at the left side of the screen here, what was surprising to us were the relationships between these 13 particular US technology companies, including IBM, Microsoft Research Asia, and Texas Instruments. And their joint ventures that were doing business in China had established these cooperative partnerships, these training sessions, specifically at universities in China that are pretty intimately connected with the defense industry. And if you move to the next slide, please. We have one example here of Synopsys, a US technology company, specifically a semiconductor design firm, which is worth a lot of money and is one of the key elements that Beijing has been trying to acquire for the past several decades. And this company, apparently, according to this document from the Ministry of Education, may have formed a training partnership with the National University of Defense Technology in China, specifically training faculty members at that university in integrated circuit design, ARC chips, and field programmable gate arrays. And this is particularly interesting, but also worrying, because this is one of the few bottlenecks that China's military has had in developing and deploying artificial intelligence. All of this is to really say that there are passive ways that US firms that are doing business in China may be inadvertently opening themselves to exploitation by the Chinese government or by firms in China, because it's simply the price of doing business in China. We've noticed a lot of American and European firms that are doing business in the country frequently complain of coerced technology transfer and of being pressured to share their intellectual property. And this is one of the ways that this kind of transfer of knowledge happens passively. Next slide, please. But it's also important to note that as well as the passive pathways that Emily's just outlined, there are active measures that the Communist Party is taking to acquire people, information, and equipment from overseas. Some important names to know here are the United Front Work Department of the Communist Party, which principally designs clandestine influence operations in other countries and organizes what are called government-organized NGOs, or GONGOs. But the United Front also runs the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, designed specifically to reach out to members of the Chinese diaspora living abroad, as well as the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Education, which pay the salaries of overseas scientists in an effort to recruit them to come work in China under formal talent recruitment plans. But the bottom line is that there are multiple kinds of incentives that the CCP and the Chinese government employ to convince scientists to come work in China. These are formal plans, business-to-business matchmaking events, entrepreneurship competitions. And as we said in the beginning, in a vacuum, many of these activities are perfectly legal. And in fact, they form the backbone of the global science and technology ecosystem. But we argue that where it becomes a problem is when the Chinese government is able to muster its economic might behind constructing pathways and systems to vacuum up this information at scale. Next slide, please. One of the ways this happens is through the United Front, this collection of organizations that are ostensibly involved in clandestine influence and technology absorption from overseas. Now, a lot of people have asked us, after we've written multiple reports about this subject, why we're able to know anything at all about the United Front if it really is engaged in these activities. And the bottom line is that a lot of the information is simply not available. These are classified as Shimi Bumen. These are classified departments of the Chinese government, and the information about how the offices are structured are frequently considered state secrets. They are not published and not knowable in the public domain. But in many cases, there are leaks or not so much leaks, but gaps in operational security that the Chinese government publishes. And so you're looking right now at an official budget justification document from the United Front Work Department in Hunan province, which shows pretty clearly that this organization finances an overseas friendship association, and it's using funding specifically earmarked to introduce foreign technical information and knowledge. And one of the ways this happens is by passing the funds first through Chinese universities, like the Hunan University of Science and Technology, which in turn forms partnerships with universities overseas in an attempt to recruit hundreds of foreign experts and famous teachers. This is a machine translation of this actual budget document that we have in front of you. And this is really the bottom line of what we're talking about when we talk about anti-competitive systems being formed and propagated by the Chinese government. Now, in CSET's State Council Budget Tracker, which we released last month, we've taken an effort to examine the actual funding of many of the offices of the Communist Party and of the central Chinese government. And we found that the China Association for Science and Technology, which is involved in constructing a lot of these kinds of partnerships, has a budget of more than $470 million every year. It's a budget tracker that I encourage you to look at right now, but it doesn't even stop with CAST, the organization I just mentioned. For a separate paper written last year in the Jamestown Foundation, we found that a lot of these United Front organizations have budgets that specifically total to more than 650 million US dollars for offices that are designed principally to influence members of the Chinese diaspora and to point toward foreign audiences. Next slide.
So to kind of loop together, we've talked about the mechanisms by which China sets up its system in order to, work through these kind of talent recruitment aspects. But another kind of more specific piece of these that Ryan and I have looked at in detail are these professional associations, or kind of the network building side of talent recruitment. So to begin with, we'll start with kind of an assessment of these professional associations that we have found. Professional associations in general provide services and networking opportunities and solidarity, or workplace solidarity, and lots of various forms of assistance to people in specific industries, ethnic groups, and in this case we're speaking of the Chinese diaspora community. But what we found kind of in digging down a little bit more on these Chinese diaspora professional associations, both in the United States and abroad, we found that some of these associations transfer technology back to China, or ask overseas Chinese to quote unquote serve the nation from abroad. And generally speaking, we've kind of broken these down into 3 different types of groups. So the first one is just completely independent professional associations that operate just for the purposes of, like that first bullet mentions, networking, workplace solidarity, those kind of things. The second group looks at what started maybe as an independent professional association, but was eventually co-opted by the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party to be used for the purposes of transferring technology. And the last group is the ones that are founded specifically by the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government for the purposes of promoting technology transfer and talent recruitment and kind of reverse brain drain issues. And what we've got on the right side here are some awards that were given to a Chinese professional association in France for their contributions to transferring technology and transferring knowledge back to China.
And in particular, just to add on this slide, it's really important to understand that professional associations in many ways are organic organizations that have taken root over decades and decades. A lot of these organizations were founded in the 80s by people who fled China. But the bottom line is that they're really important organizations that do work to protect Asian Americans. And they form principally because of the kinds of discrimination that have been suffered upon those communities, even just this week. But unfortunately, there are overlapping interests that can coincide with those of the party. And it's really difficult to distinguish the kinds of organizations we've laid out here. In most cases, the relationship between an organization and the Communist Party may be more complicated or convoluted than we can really lay out. Next slide.
Yeah, and I would just say before we switch over to, and this kind of just loops back to one of the first points I made about this not being black and white. There is a significant amount of nuance needed to assess risk, assess vulnerability, and a bunch of other things in kind of dealing with these types of organizations.
So for a report that Emily and I had published last March, I think it was, entitled Overseas Professionals and Technology Transfer to China, we investigated a lot of these organizations, as many as we could find, about 208. And we found that 126 of those groups had claimed in Chinese on their websites that they were transferring technology to China, either by exchanging technical information, by bringing scientists to China temporarily or to work full-time at Chinese research and development institutions, or advertising and referring their members to apply to state-backed talent recruitment plans. These groups claimed to represent more than 145,000 members, but the really important point here is that 2/3 of these groups operate outside the United States. And so it's particularly important for the United States government to coordinate with its allies and partners, particularly those countries in Europe, but as well as Japan and South Korea, which share the brunt of the threat posed by technology transfer, especially when it's unwanted.
So I know Ryan mentioned state-backed talent plans, and just to dig into those for a moment, I'm sure a lot of people on this call have heard of 1,000 Talents, Qianren Jihua. It is, at this point, I would say probably the most well-known Chinese state-backed talent recruitment plan. So we thought we'd cover it just briefly by showing a piece of it that people don't often hear about, which is the Youth 1,000 Talents Plan. So the branch of 1,000 Talents that focuses on people under the age of 40. And what we've got here on the left is actually a screenshot of a baseball card from the CSET Chinese Talent Program Tracker that is a repository of Chinese talent program sourcing information, and tries to paint the picture of, what exactly are these talent programs about. And as we can see here on the left with the Youth 1,000 Talents program, we get information about is Chinese citizenship required, who is the target audience, what year the program was initiated, as well as some kind of additional information about the various benefits, the residency requirements, and things like that. So I encourage you to check that out at some point. But I think what we're trying to show here again, and the 1,000 Talents Plan has actually been absorbed into a different program here now called the High-End Foreign Expert Recruitment Plan, as I noted at the bottom of that baseball card. But what we want to show really, and I think Ryan will get a little bit more into the details of this when he discusses the figure on the right, but these talent programs are adapting as China is kind of shifting to I would say fit its message with concerns stemming from the United States, from Australia, from Europe. We've seen, terms disappear. For example, we saw this with Made in China 2025. We've now seen it with 1,000 Talents, where a term just somehow mysteriously disappears off the internet. And I think I just wanted to, there's a lot of still talk about these types of talent programs. And I think the important thing about understanding Chinese state-backed talent recruitment programs is the kind of landscape and breadth and depth of these programs. It's not just 1,000 Talents program. There are actually somewhere between like 250 and 500 national, provincial, and municipal level talent programs that come out of China. And I think even if we see terms like 1,000 Talents Plan disappear, that does not necessarily mean it's done and or it's been replaced. I think, China is working to, like I said, adapt its messaging so it can, try and work with whatever scrutiny it's getting from the international community.
Another topic that we've been exploring at CSET, in addition to the volume of talent plans that are apparently in operation, are the specifics of some of those larger plans. So in a report that I wrote with Jacob Feldgoys last year, we were actually able to find lists of individuals who had been offered awards under the Youth 1,000 Talents Plan. And we tried to assess how frequently these individuals really are offered positions at defense-related institutions in China, where these individuals come from, if they were trained, for example, or employed in the United States. And so you can see from the graph on the right that the scope of the Communist Party's effort to recruit overseas scientists has been increasing with time. It's not just the United States. A variety of other countries serve as the sources of many of the people who have been recruited under talent recruitment programs, including 1,000 Talents. But as we move to the next slide, one of the really concerning trends here is in support for the defense industry. Jacob and I found in that report that about 8% of Youth 1,000 Talents participants were offered jobs at defense-related institutions in China. 36 individuals we could confirm were offered jobs at CAPE, the China Academy of Engineering Physics, which is China's nuclear weapons laboratory. And many of them were employed in the United States at the time they were offered those positions. But now, Emily, I think would like to talk a bit more about some of the other concerning trends that we've noticed in these talent recruitment programs and really why we're talking about them with you today.
Yeah, a lot of the questions that Ryan and I get, when we mention 1,000 Talents or other talent recruitment programs is kind of, what's the so what? Why should we be concerned about these in the US? And so, like Ryan said, military support and support for the defense industry is a key piece of that. But there are two others that I think require, some type of assessment here too. The first being anti-competitive behavior. And, talking about anti-competitive behavior in the context of China is not new. We've been dealing with this, before its ascension to the WTO in 2001 and since then. But in cases where U.S. entities and U.S. partner countries are working to kind of be magnets for innovation and try and compete globally for, advanced science and technology, these companies, entities, universities are forced to compete with Chinese entities that are backed by significant amounts of state funding, which makes it incredibly difficult for, for example, a startup working in drone technology in the United States to compete with a state-backed drone company in China, who doesn't necessarily have the same fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders or any of the other kind of, I would say, constraints put on it by kind of, normal international scientific or competitive norms. Besides that too, we see some aspects of criminal activity. For example, there have been cases recently that have gone through the Department of Justice where people have lied on their visa applications and not acknowledged they were part of certain types of Chinese talent programs, or have not acknowledged that they were part of the Chinese military and have come here, taken up visiting researcher positions or worked in various companies in the United States and elsewhere, and have not exactly been as forthcoming as we would hope. So, I mean, again, and I know we talked about military civil fusion a bit as well, and I know Ryan hit on it with the side of, the military support, but I think one of the key aspects of military civil fusion that gets misunderstood is that it is not just a program that aims to bolster China's military modernization, but it also is working to bolster China's economic competitiveness. So I think that understanding that and understanding that China is not just trying to bolster its military, it's also trying to improve its ability to compete economically worldwide, adds a different kind of context to these kind of concerning trends.
And on the note about economic competition, just to briefly explain the figure on the right for folks who might not speak Chinese, this is an excerpt of a 34-page document listing 900 technology projects that have apparently been transferred to China by the China Association of Science and Technology that we mentioned earlier. And it's this volume of economic activity that is apparently being returned to China that we're really trying to emphasize as an issue, especially when it's paired with these three trends: anti-competitive behavior, criminal activity, and support for the military. But another really concerning trend here is in differing messages being presented to different audiences. Now, one of the common points made by Chinese diplomats when they're explaining the role of the United Front, for example, is that it's a perfectly normal way of engaging with scientists overseas, and that this is really no different from normal international science and technology cooperation. But one of the questions, at least that Emily and I have raised in the course of our research, is why it seems there are these different messages being presented to overseas Chinese and to people who speak, for example, English or other languages. There's a common phrase in the China studies community, which is that in some cases, Mandarin is being used as a form of soft encryption, that the party needs to retain some way to communicate with the assets that it's been cultivating overseas. And so we decided to put this hypothesis to the test by examining whether the English language web pages and the Chinese language web pages of several of these professional associations differed. And we found that they did differ substantively in about 40% of cases. That is, entire paragraphs were missing, or really important pieces of information were not presented in English. And in the 19 of the 20 cases that we looked at where this was the case, 19 of them mentioned that they were transferring technology in Chinese and omitted those details from English. They were not saying in English that they were encouraging their members to apply for 1,000 talents, but they were doing so in Chinese. Emily, I think you want to add a bit to this and some of the examples that we found.
Yes, and I would just say too, a lot of people in the China policy community are probably familiar with this phenomenon. It is not a new thing. This is the same with Chinese company websites. We've seen this happening. It's not just a professional association thing. So I wanted to point that out. But as you can see here, we see some like kind of key, almost jargony Chinese Communist Party phrases that show up in that box on the right. For example, we see here that whole idea of serving the country in various ways, or encouraging overseas students to return to serve the country. It's this type of language that we think, maybe by itself, if it were in English and Chinese, maybe wouldn't, it would still be somewhat problematic. But the fact that it is omitted in the English language and included in the Chinese shows again the omission is intentional and they are trying to obfuscate certain pieces of information. So the other things that we see specific mentions in Chinese of Chinese, like, large scale Chinese strategies, like when Belt and Road Initiative was a big thing, certain companies or professional associations would mention that in Chinese, not in English. Same with Made in China 2025 and a lot of these others. So I encourage, even if you don't speak Chinese, to just, I know things like Google Chrome have, has great abilities to connect to Google Translate, or just Google Translate itself. Just do the quick comparison and you'll probably be surprised with what you find. And I think, so lastly, before we open it up for questions, Ryan and I just wanted to end with, again, some of the so what, like what is problematic about specifically talent plans. So the one that we'll bring up here is one that is still relatively well known, but maybe less well known than 1,000 Talents, is the Hongqing Scholars program, or the Yangtze River Scholars. And what we've done here is we've taken some machine translations on the left of certain application requirements or procedures for the Hongqing Scholars program as of 2020. So these are the recent ones. And there are certain aspects of these application requirements that should stand out as red flags, especially if you're a researcher, if you work in academia, especially since Hongqing Scholars is meant for professors. But as you can see here, so for example, they ask for copies of certificates of all scientific research projects, awards, and patents that you've listed in your recommendation or in your resume. They also ask for the full text of 5 important innovative papers, copies of the magazine covers, as well as any other copies and first pages of anything else you've included on your resume. And so to kind of bucket those two together, we've got just a ton of information that they're looking for just to even apply to the position. This is not even, you haven't even gotten the job yet. So to me, that hints at, some interesting, I would say, developments as far as technology transfer, information sharing. So there's some issues associated with that. And then the last piece that is also part of the Hongqing Scholars program, if you're accepted, is recruiting other Hongqing Scholar candidates from other schools. And we've seen this come up in various Department of Justice indictments as well recently, where we've seen that in order to be a Hongqing Scholar, you're not just kind of, working as a professor in China, working on your own research, whereas with a lot of other talent programs, that's usually the extent. But for Hongqing Scholars, they want you to go out and recruit the next round of Hongqing Scholars. So there's a network building side of this talent program that I think makes it unique and poses an interesting and kind of unique threat.
And it's this snowball effect that's also contributed to the volume of talent recruitment that has been successfully accomplished by the Chinese government. Now, on the right side of the screen, you're looking at a direct quotation from the budget justification in 2019 for the Chinese Ministry of Education. And the ministry pays the actual bonuses of people recruited under talent programs like Hongqing Scholars, as well as the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security. You can read all of their budget documents and see quotes like this in CSET's State Council Budget Tracker. But I want to draw your attention to this line, which illustrates that in 2019, the Communist Party paid more than $47 million in signing bonuses for people under the Hongqing Scholars and other talent recruitment programs. And if this is actually accurate, and if this amount of money is being paid year over year, then it stands to reason that factoring in other groups like funding for the United Front and funding by the Ministry of Science and Technology for other talent recruitment programs, then the Communist Party has likely made more than $1 billion in individual payments to overseas scientists over the past 10 years. It's this kind of mass scale and mounting of resources by the government of China and the Communist Party that is contributing the kind of anti-competitive behavior that we've been discussing. But in sum, this has been really just a light touch of a lot of the research that we've been conducting at CSET. We've put out individual reports about each of these topics in pretty great detail, and I would encourage you to check out all of our research at cset.georgetown.edu.
And with that, I'll hand it back over to Anna and Lynn.
Thank you, Emily and Ryan, for the overview of your recent and cutting edge work. Folks in the audience, the links to the trackers that have been mentioned during the presentation are in the chat below, and we will share them in a follow-up email after this. Anna gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A. In the meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question, now is the time to type it in the chat. We may not get to all of them, and we'll do our best to cover as much ground as possible. Those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Anna, back over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Emily and Ryan. So I think our first question comes at the source of some of this information. There has been a lot of discussion about some of these materials, especially related to Made in China 2025 disappearing. And so we was wondering, the question is, any insight on how to identify some of these programs and these recruiting channels with the information not being as forthcoming and not kind of the lack of transparency.
So I can start, and I'm sure Ryan has some thoughts too. So identifying these types of programs, especially when I was trying to build the Chinese talent program tracker, is I sympathize with the fact that it is difficult, because it's not like you can go to one website and there's just going to be like an entire list of all these programs. Maybe at one point there was, but it's gotten a lot harder. So what I recommend is usually, and I know some people have done this, is kind of start to create your own like internal database of key words, like almost like a glossary to help you look for certain kind of words that come up a lot, because the Chinese, especially in high-level policy documents and state-sponsored media, will often use very similar statements. So with talent programs, I mean, just using the Chinese, for example, talent program, Rencai Jihua, you can usually get a lot from that. And I will say it does also require a little bit of maneuvering as far as, VPNs. Sometimes you get different results if you change your location on a VPN. Ryan and I have become experts at archiving all of our findings on the on various types of perma CC, Wayback Machine, things like that, so we can access them even if the site has disappeared. But yeah, I would say starting with a glossary, and even if you're someone with no Chinese language experience, there are apps like Pleco. There are great dictionaries online like MDBG, and even Google Translate at this point has gotten really good. And I highly recommend, plugging in certain terms there, starting there, and kind of going forward.
And I would just add 2 points to that. First is that there really is an ocean of open source information that's still available. You have to look for it in Chinese, but I would say that's no excuse for people who don't speak Chinese that are working on issues of technology transfer in China. I will be the first to be very forthright about my own language limitations. I'm currently studying Chinese at Georgetown, but I've had to rely quite a bit on machine translation and the great work of folks at CSET who've been studying the language for years and years. But you can still find this information. You've got to look and identify some of the phrases that are being presented over and over again. You can read automatic machine translations to get an idea of what those phrases are, but it is simply not an excuse to not know the language. The resources exist, and ignoring half of them is not tenable in the US-China relationship moving forward. The second point I would add is that Emily's exactly right on the importance of archiving sources. Even in conducting these studies and compiling the information that we have for this presentation, multiple of the sources no longer exist in their proper form. We only have archived links available and downloaded PDFs. A lot of sources burn very quickly, and it's something that is becoming a real problem for the China studies community as transparency is waning further and further.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of questions that ask whether these programs and these policies are US specific, or do we see these kinds of activities in Europe or Asia or other places?
Yeah, I would just say that this is not at all US specific. In many cases, the Chinese government has really, I would say, tried to take a broad brush to this and say, wherever the technology or science or know-how is, go out and find it. There are instances where we've seen, maybe studies within various Chinese think tanks or government offices that do research that say, oh, well, we see that Israel is really good at this type of artificial intelligence, or we see that, Japan and South Korea are really good for, semiconductors or things like that. So, I mean, it's not that the policies themselves are country specific, but there are sometimes guidances or recommendations that say, if you're in this field, maybe check out that country. Or in some instances, we've seen examples where someone either of Chinese descent, of Chinese ethnicity, or even not people that are not of Chinese ethnicity happen to be studying somewhere in Europe, Australia, Japan, United States, and happen to be an expert in that field. And sometimes the Chinese government, as we've seen, will approach them and say, hey, you're really good at what you do. You want to come work for us? So, I mean, it goes both ways, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So we have a number of questions that ask, how is this different, what we're seeing with companies and or this acquisition supporting military, given some of the universities here in the US that work with the US military?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. This is a point we hear really frequently, and there's no denying that there are similarities. I mean, look at a college like Carnegie Mellon or Georgia Tech, and they work pretty closely with the US military, sure. But the difference here lies in how a lot of Chinese universities are literally administered and funded. 75 of China's leading universities are directly run by the Ministry of Education. They have cells of communist youth leagues that operate inside the universities. They are remanded to provide teams of internet commentators to engage in, for example, online trolling at the behest of the Communist Party. This is an entirely separate topic, but it's one instance of how universities' research portfolios differ, how the social climate at universities differs, but in particular, among the defense-affiliated universities that we covered in our report, these universities are directly administered by SASTIND, the State Administration for Science, Technology, and Defense, which is run by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology that belongs to the Chinese government. Their specific goal is to develop technologies for the Chinese military, and they state that over and over in public documents that justify their existence and their funding levels.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions that ask, what are some of the policy options that the US can do and its allies to try to mitigate this behavior?
So there are certain things I would say, I mean, obviously, like I said earlier in the presentation, the US policy can't take like a broad brush approach to this. It needs to be much more nuanced and much more, I would say, specific. And I think there are certain US policy moves that have happened over the past few years that I think are moving in the right direction. For example, the May 2020 visa proclamation that aimed at restricting certain students from specific Chinese universities to come and get visas in the US. Again, there's not a public list of universities in China that were banned in that instance, but Ryan and I collaborated with one of our CSET colleagues, Remco Zwetsloot, and we found that based on our estimates, it appears that only about 1% of Chinese students and scholars in the United States would be affected by this proclamation. So to me, that's a great example of like a scalpel policy that can kind of help with some of these technology transfer issues when it comes to talent recruitment in universities. I would say also that, Ryan just mentioned the 7 Sons of National Defense, the universities that are administered by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And I think those, which as of December of 2020 are all now on the Department of Commerce's entity list. I think those are kind of the more low-hanging fruit examples where we see, okay, there's a direct line to the PLA, to the defense industry, and therefore we need to, kind of crack down on that. Whereas other universities, I would argue, things like Tsinghua University, Peking University, that are kind of like, these top universities in China, I think we can't take the same type of approach to those universities, and we need to kind of dig a little deeper to maybe the departmental level, the laboratory level, and find specific parts of those universities that are problematic in the eyes of the U.S. government to ensure that we're not, just taking, anyone who graduated from Tsinghua University is therefore bad and we can't let them come to the U.S. because I think that would be beyond detrimental for the United States.
And if I can add here, it's a really good question. What more we can do? To get down to brass tacks, the United States is doing a lot. It has a lot of laws on the books that it uses pretty regularly. Wire fraud and visa fraud are actual crimes that you can bring against talent plan participants who have allegedly committed those crimes. If you look at overseas professional associations that operate in the United States, we investigated as many as possible. About 26 of the 28 groups we found located in the United States that claim to transfer technology in some way to China are registered as nonprofits. Most of them are 501c3s. And so if you were really concerned about their activities, you would simply investigate what they're claiming to do in Chinese. And if they're consulting and not upholding the spirit of a 501c3, then you have resources and tools you can use at your disposal to deal with these threats as they emerge. But let's get really down to brass tacks here. It's a hard problem. The United States has struggled to do this because you can't make it a crime to engage with scientists overseas. That's why the Communist Party has been constructing these pipelines to exploit the very foundation of the global science and technology ecosystem. And they've been doing it very successfully. So what really needs to happen are adopting the kinds of low-hanging fruit policies that Emily was just talking about, like listing the 7 suns as some of the prohibited destinations of US technology exports is a great start. That's what we advocated for over the winter. And there's some other low-hanging fruit policies, but really the issue comes down to enforcement. Not just enforcement, but also awareness, because of different authorities afforded to the intelligence community, to the military. And that's why we've been pushing, and so many people in this space have been pushing for just a broader approach to research security that's adopted by institutions themselves, by companies in the United States, by universities in the United States that are constructing relationships with Chinese counterparts. It ultimately falls to them because that's where the brunt of the issue lies.
And I would just add quickly too, the other point, Ryan mentioned awareness. I think one of the things that the US government needs is more Chinese language expertise and area studies. A lot of these issues are things that, like Ryan said, the Chinese language, or the Chinese often use Chinese language as soft encryption. And I think we need people who have the capacity to, get through that first layer of that soft encryption. And that's people who have Chinese language expertise. So I think moving forward, adding, I know the House Intelligence Committee released a report last year about kind of improving the intelligence community's ability to attract and maintain Chinese language expertise and talent. And that's a good first step, but I think, other departments, other agencies need that same type of expertise.
Okay, thank you. We do have a number of questions that are geared around how do these programs actually differ than some of the other talent recruitment programs worldwide? What makes these stand out in the kind of, as you were talking about, counter to global norms?
So just a quick example, I was looking recently at a scholarship program that's actually on the CSET talent program tracker called the National Defense Science and Technology Scholarship. That's a scholarship given to 2,000 students in China annually, and with that, students are required to it pays for their education, and then they're required to work in the defense industry in China for a minimum of 5 years after. And as you mentioned, I mean, this sounds really familiar to a lot of U.S. programs, like, for example, the Boren Fellowship that has that same type of, we'll pay for a program and you have to come work for us after, or even like an ROTC program. But where we see these getting more problematic is some of the, I would say, requirements that we've found. So, for example, in this National Defense Science and Technology Scholarship, there are certain rules as far as what is deemed a breach of contract. And one of those is if you say things against the Chinese Communist Party, if you have anti-socialist tendencies or make anti-socialist remarks or participate in what they refer to as illegal organizations, you can lose all your funding. Whereas I would, the Boren does not require you to hold such allegiances with the US government.
Okay, thank you. I think I actually might add as well, when you look at some of the applications they do actually ask to hide any affiliation with some of these programs. So they're really, from the start, a lack of transparency, and there's a level of opacity that a lot of these other programs do not have. We do have one other question, or actually a number of questions, but this one actually gets at, so there are a number of talent programs really geared at the S&T fields. Are there other experts such as economists or financial experts? And what are we seeing in that area? Have these programs elaborate or evolved to include those kinds of areas, or is it still very STEM focused?
Yes, those other kinds of experts are definitely targeted. If you look at Thousand Talents in particular, for example, there are several branches of the program that are specifically designed to target members of the business community, medical professionals, entrepreneurs, a whole separate category of technology transfer that we didn't really dive into in this presentation is specifically geared toward recruiting entrepreneurs, those recent graduates, those PhD students, those postdocs who may have found some innovation in their research, might hold a patent and might decide to establish a company. And the Chinese government wants those people to move to China and establish those companies in China. And so this is a really wide-ranging interest at the behest of the party and the government. They really are trying to acquire people, information, and equipment across all sectors.
And I would just add briefly too, so that Hongqing Scholars program that we mentioned actually is split into, so it's split into different levels of, age groups like Thousand Talents, but it's also split by people that work in the hard sciences versus those who work in social sciences or humanities. So there are different requirements for both sides, but again, Hongqing Scholars is looking for people in the humanities as well. So it's not just hard sciences.
So can you tell us, we have a number of questions surrounding financing. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the money moves in China's system, or who is actually funding some of these programs and the support for those?
Sure. So I'm happy to talk more generally about this. The money tends to flow from the top, if you want to describe it in very kind of obtuse terms, right? The United Front Work Department of the Communist Party will fund organizations overseas, will pass funding to universities, will pass funding to the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, which will then pass funding to the aforementioned entities I've just listed. But ultimately, it's funding that comes either from the departmental budget of organizations that belong to the party, or the departmental budgets of organizations that belong to the government. They both are funded from the same pool and ultimately resourced with the same taxes that Chinese citizens pay. But this funding in turn can change hands any number of times. It depends on the specific form of cooperation you're talking about. In the case of, for example, a researcher working in the United States, they may be working on a project and receive a grant from some organization that's interested in their work that may have received funding from the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security in China. And the money that funding actually came from may have come from the United Front Work Department. So it quickly becomes a tangled web. But the point is that this is the point, obfuscating the original source of funds. But if you do enough sleuthing, you can kind of figure out which offices are subordinate to other offices and where they may have already been receiving funding to begin with. It is, however, very tricky. Yeah.
So we have a number of questions regarding students and the questions about what we gain, especially what the US and the EU and other Asian countries gain from having overseas students here. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the challenges and promises of these student programs?
Yeah, so I can say, so I mentioned Remco's Wetzeluk before. He's done some excellent research on kind of the competitive AI education front and kind of talent flows associated with that, particularly as it relates to Chinese PhD students. But I want to throw out a quote here that came from William Evanina, who's the head of counterintelligence for the United States. And he had a quote recently that said that we allow 350,000 or so Chinese students every year. And that's a lot, and we have a very liberal visa policy for them. And 99.9% of those students are here legitimately and doing great research and helping the global economy. But it is a tool that is used by the Chinese government to facilitate nefarious activity here in the US. So I think that shows, the majority of Chinese students and scholars that come here are really coming here with the intention of, doing great research, contributing to our economy, contributing to our innovation. It's, the problem comes down to those pieces that get co-opted, as we've talked about, or the instances where there is that 1% or 0.1% that maybe come here with nefarious intentions. So I think at this point, my goal, if I were in U.S. government, I think I'd want to be in a position to make it easier for these Chinese students to come to the U.S. and feel comfortable here, especially in light of some of the issues surrounding racism, but especially making them feel comfortable on college campuses, so that they really want to kind of interact with everyone on a campus. They want to contribute to campus life. They want to, again, be part of those ecosystems, because I think that is going to help in kind of, wanting them to stay here and having them feel welcomed, and maybe eventually they might want to apply to be a US citizen, and hopefully we can move them in that direction.
I realize we're nearly at time, but I want to add 3 very brief points here. One, the vast majority of students in the United States are not funded by the Chinese government. I wrote a primer last year called the China Scholarship Council, an overview, which actually goes into the data of how many students are funded by the Ministry of Education to study in the United States. Fewer than 10% likely receive funding from the MOE. And some of those students are required to return to China after their scholarship provisions end, but not all of them. Second, the people who mainly engage in the kind of espionage activities that you hear about are typically graduate students. We also found in our report on universities and the science and technology workforce in China that almost everyone who's recruited to work at defense SOEs is a graduate student. Very few undergraduates go directly to work at the Lockheed Martins and the Raytheons of China and do that kind of engineering work. So looking at undergraduates in the United States is not necessarily the smartest or the most efficient use of government resources. And finally, just the last point I want to make here is the most efficient way to compete with China's talent recruitment plans is to better fund and provide opportunities for people who would otherwise be attracted to them. This is a numbers game. And for decades, the United States has been able to kind of coast by on the promise of the American dream, but that might no longer be adequate. And we need to really provide support for the scientists and to compete for global talent if we want to maintain the United States S&T dominance.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
All right. Well, on behalf of CSET, I'd like to thank our moderator, Anna Puglisi, and speakers Ryan Fedasiuk and Emily Weinstein. Many thanks as well to all of you for attending and for your many thought-provoking questions. We're only sorry we could not get to them all. We really appreciate your being with us today, and we'll soon share details of our next event. In the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.